Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
Important. Ashbourne Court stood upon a low rise overlooking the village of Eldercombe like a fading memory of another age. Built from pale grey stone and framed by ancient cedar trees, the sprawling estate had once belonged to one of the wealthiest families in the county. Even now, despite years of declining fortunes and neglected repairs, the house retained an air of quiet authority that seemed woven into its very walls. The villagers still spoke of Ashbourne Court with a mixture of admiration and unease, particularly the unease, because the Ashbourne family had always possessed a talent for preserving appearances while concealing unhappiness beneath polished surfaces. On the evening everything changed. The court hosted its annual harvest dinner, an old tradition revived each autumn to reassure the village that the estate remained prosperous despite persistent rumors to the contrary. Lanterns glowed warmly across the terraces while servants moved through the grand hall carrying silver trays and crystal glasses. Laughter drifted beneath the vaulted ceilings, though now and then conversations faltered whenever certain members of the Ashbourne family entered the room. Miss Marple noticed this almost immediately. She sat quietly beside Mrs. Bantry near the drawing-room fireplace, stirring tea delicately while observing the guests with mild interest. "My dear," Mrs. Bantry whispered, "there's enough tension in this house to snap piano wires." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes drifted calmly across the room. "Yes," she murmured softly. Families with financial troubles often become remarkably theatrical, especially wealthy families. At the far end of the room stood Benedict Ashbourne, master of the estate. Important, tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed, he possessed the polished charm of a man long accustomed to authority. Yet beneath that charm lingered visible strain. His younger son, Julian, lounged nearby with careless elegance and a wineglass permanently in hand. Unlike his father, Julian made little effort to disguise his cynicism. Near the staircase stood Evelyn Ashbourne, Benedict's widowed daughter-in-law, whose quiet composure seemed almost too perfect. Beside her lingered Dr. Simon Vale, the family physician, speaking in low tones no one else appeared intended to hear. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer immediately. "There's gossip there, certainly." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Yes, though perhaps not romantic gossip." At that moment the front doors opened and Inspector Daniel Harrow entered unexpectedly from the chilly evening outside. His arrival caused a subtle but unmistakable shift throughout the room. Benedict Ashbourne stiffened instantly. Julian smiled coldly into his drink. "Interesting indeed," thought Miss Marple. Inspector Harrow removed his gloves calmly. "My apologies for arriving uninvited," he said. "I merely wished to clarify several financial matters concerning estate contracts filed earlier this month." A silence settled briefly across the drawing-room. Benedict recovered first. "Surely that could wait until tomorrow." "Ordinarily, yes," the inspector replied politely, "but certain irregularities require prompt attention." Miss Marple observed Benedict carefully. Not fear exactly, alarm. The distinction mattered. Julian Ashbourne gave a short laugh. "Well," he murmured loudly enough for several guests to hear, "perhaps tonight's entertainment has improved already." Benedict turned sharply toward him. "Enough." Julian merely smiled. "Important." The dinner proceeded soon afterward, though the atmosphere never fully recovered. Beneath the soft candlelight and polished silverware, tension lingered heavily around the long dining table. Miss Marple listened far more than she spoke. She noticed Evelyn Ashbourne barely touched her meal. She noticed Dr. Vale watched Benedict constantly. Most importantly, she noticed Julian seemed almost eager for confrontation. Dangerously eager. As dessert was served, Julian finally raised his wineglass with theatrical amusement. "A toast," he announced. Several guests looked uncomfortable immediately. Benedict's expression darkened. "Julian, no, Father." "Truly," Julian smiled thinly. "To honesty, a rare and endangered quality at Ashbourne Court." An uneasy silence followed. Evelyn lowered her eyes instantly. Dr. Vale's hand tightened around his glass. Miss Marple folded her hands softly in her lap. "Ah, there it is. Not merely family resentment, blackmail," Julian continued smoothly. It's extraordinary how long secrets survive in old houses. Enough, Benedict said sharply now. But Julian leaned back calmly. Or perhaps Inspector Harrow would enjoy hearing how certain estate accounts were managed after my brother's death. The room froze completely. Evelyn Ashbourne looked suddenly pale. Inspector Harrow's attention sharpened immediately. Benedict rose slowly from his chair. "You are drunk, not remotely." Father and son stared at one another across the candlelit table with years of buried hatred hanging silently between them. Then Julian smiled faintly. "Tell me, Father, how much longer did you think the truth would stay buried?" Without another word, Benedict Ashbourne left the dining room. A strained murmur spread among the guests almost immediately afterward. "Mrs. Important," Bantry whispered anxiously. "Good heavens." Miss Marple remained thoughtful. Not anger alone, she reflected quietly. Fear, real fear. Moments later, Julian pushed back his chair carelessly and followed toward the western corridor leading to Benedict's private study. Inspector Harrow watched him go. So did Dr. Vale. So did Evelyn. Too many eyes following one man. Miss Marple noticed that carefully. Outside, wind rustled softly through the cedar trees surrounding Ashbourne Court while distant thunder rolled faintly across the hills. Then suddenly a gunshot echoed through the western wing. The sound shattered the evening instantly. Women screamed. A wineglass fell and broke across the dining room floor. For one suspended moment nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. Inspector Harrow rushed first toward the study corridor while guests stumbled after him in confusion and panic. Miss Marple rose slowly beside Mrs. Bantry. Already she had noticed something peculiar. When the gunshot sounded, Evelyn Ashbourne had not looked shocked. She had looked resigned, important. The western corridor filled rapidly with frightened voices and hurried footsteps. Servants emerged from side passages in confusion while several dinner guests hesitated nervously near the entrance to Benedict Ashbourne's private study. Inspector Harrow reached the door first. It stood slightly open. He pushed it inward carefully. A sharp smell of gunpowder lingered in the room. Julian Ashbourne lay sprawled beside the fireplace, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. Blood darkened the front of his evening jacket, spreading slowly across the polished floorboards. Near the overturned armchair rested a revolver. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Dr. Simon Vale stepped forward quickly and knelt beside the body. His face tightened almost immediately. "He's dead." A murmur of shock spread through the corridor behind them. Mrs. Bantry pressed one hand to her chest while several guests turned away pale-faced. Yet Miss Marple's attention moved not toward Julian himself but across the room surrounding him. The study appeared strangely disturbed. Desk drawers stood partially open. Papers had been scattered near the writing desk. A crystal decanter lay shattered beside the hearth, too disturbed perhaps, because amidst the apparent chaos, several objects remained unnaturally untouched. The lamp beside the desk still burned steadily. The bookshelves showed no sign of struggle, and the expensive bronze horse mounted upon the mantelpiece sat perfectly aligned. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harrow crouched beside the revolver carefully. "One shot fired," he murmured. Dr. Vale rose slowly. "It appears straightforward enough." Miss Marple glanced quietly toward him. Straightforward, an interesting choice of word. At that moment Benedict Ashbourne entered the study doorway. Important. The color drained visibly from his face as he saw Julian's body. My God, his voice sounded genuine. Yet beneath the shock lingered something else. Exhaustion. Inspector Harrow straightened slowly. "When did you last see your son alive?" 10 minutes ago, perhaps." Benedict swallowed hard. "At dinner, and afterward. I came directly here." "Alone?" "Yes." Inspector Harrow's eyes narrowed slightly. "So Julian followed you?" Benedict hesitated. "I assume so." The inspector studied him carefully. "Did you argue?" A tense silence followed. "Yes." "About what?" Benedict looked briefly toward the watching guests. "Private family matters." Julian's bitter toast still hung heavily in everyone's memory. Private matters indeed. Miss Marple noticed Evelyn Ashbourne standing silently near the corridor entrance, one hand gripping the doorway tightly. Unlike the others, she never once looked directly at Julian's body. Curious, very curious. Inspector Harrow continued questioning calmly. Who else entered this corridor after dinner? Several uncertain glances passed between the guests. Dr. Vale spoke first. I remained briefly in the dining room. Evelyn nodded faintly. So did I. But eventually you came this way? The inspector asked. Yes. But what time? Just after the gunshot, Miss Marple observed her quietly. Not entirely truthful. People recalling traumatic events often answered too quickly when rehearsed explanations already existed in their minds. Meanwhile, Inspector Harrow examined the scattered papers across the floor. One document caught his attention almost immediately. Estate transfer agreements. Several signatures appeared marked in heavy ink, including Julian's. The inspector frowned deeply. Important. What exactly was Julian threatening to expose tonight? Benedict's jaw tightened faintly. He believed the estate accounts concealed irregularities after my elder son's death. And did they? A silence settled heavily across the study. Finally, Benedict answered quietly. Yes. Murmurs spread instantly among the guests behind them. Inspector Harrow looked up sharply. You admit financial deception? I adjusted certain records to prevent Ashbourne Court from collapsing after Charles died. Benedict's expression hardened. Without intervention, the estate would have been ruined within a year. Miss Marple folded her hands softly. Money again, but never only money. Inspector Harrow continued calmly. And Julian discovered this recently. Yes. And threatened exposure. Yes. The inspector glanced once more toward the revolver near Julian's body. A son blackmailing his father. A violent argument. A loaded weapon. He looked toward Benedict steadily. You understand how this appears? Benedict said nothing. Then suddenly Miss Marple noticed something peculiar near the shattered decanter beside the fireplace. No spilled liquid. Not a single stain darkened the carpet beneath the broken glass. Her eyes softened faintly. Ah! Someone, it seemed, had already begun arranging the scene before panic properly settled over Ashbourne Court. Important. By the following morning, news of Julian Ashbourne's death had spread throughout Eldercombe with astonishing speed. Villagers gathered in hushed groups outside the bakery and post office, exchanging theories with the eager certainty only small communities could produce. Some insisted Benedict Ashbourne had finally lost patience with his reckless son. Others blamed gambling debts, hidden affairs, or long-buried family hatred. Nobody yet possessed facts, but that had never prevented village gossip before. Inside Ashbourne Court, the atmosphere had grown colder still. Curtains remained drawn across most windows while servants moved silently through the corridors as though afraid the house itself might overhear them. Miss Marple sat near the breakfast-room fireplace with Mrs. Bantry, quietly observing the strained faces gathered around the table. Benedict Ashbourne looked exhausted but composed. Evelyn Ashbourne appeared pale and distant. Dr. Simon Vale maintained professional calm, though his eyes betrayed lack of sleep. Only Inspector Harrow seemed fully alert, his notebook already open beside untouched coffee. The revolver belonged to Benedict Ashbourne, he announced calmly. Registered legally 15 years ago. Mrs. Bantry exchanged a nervous glance with Miss Marple. Inspector Harrow continued. Mr. Ashbourne admits arguing with his son immediately before the shooting. His eyes lifted toward Benedict. However, no witness actually saw the shot fired. Benedict's expression remained rigid. I left Julian alive in the study. Yet nobody saw you leave the corridor, the inspector replied quietly. An uncomfortable silence followed. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Something still troubled her greatly about the study itself. Important, not merely the arranged disorder. The timing. People staging crime scenes after sudden violence often overcompensated emotionally. Yet the room had appeared almost carefully theatrical. Too controlled. At that moment, Evelyn Ashbourne spoke softly for the first time that morning. Perhaps Julian intended someone to kill him eventually. The remark startled everyone slightly. Inspector Harrow looked toward her carefully. What do you mean? Evelyn lowered her eyes toward her untouched breakfast plate. He enjoyed humiliating people, especially my family. Her voice remained calm but tired. He pushed others until they broke. Interesting indeed. Not grief. Resentment. Dr. Vale spoke quietly beside her. Julian had become increasingly unstable these past months. Inspector Harrow's attention sharpened. In what way? He drank heavily, gambled constantly, threatened people. Miss Marple glanced softly toward the doctor. Threatened. Another interesting choice. Inspector Harrow leaned back slightly. Did he threaten you personally? Dr. Vale hesitated almost imperceptibly. Yes. The room fell silent. About what exactly? The inspector asked. A private matter. Inspector Harrow's tone hardened faintly. Private matters appeared dangerously relevant at Ashbourne Court. Dr. Vale removed his spectacles slowly. Julian believed I concealed information regarding Charles Ashbourne's death. Mrs. Bantry blinked in surprise. The elder son? Yes. Dr. Vale's face tightened faintly. Charles died 3 years ago after a riding accident. Miss Marple's eyes lifted quietly. Accident. Such a useful word in wealthy families. Inspector Harrow frowned. And Julian suspected otherwise? He suspected many things. The silence that followed seemed unusually heavy. Important. Miss Marple noticed Evelyn Ashbourne grip her teacup tighter now. Fear again. Not for herself perhaps, but fear nonetheless. After breakfast, Miss Marple wandered slowly through the western corridor leading once more toward Benedict's study. The constables guarding the entrance allowed her passage politely enough after Inspector Harrow nodded consent. Inside, morning light revealed details less visible the previous evening. The scattered papers near the desk, the overturned armchair, the broken decanter beside the hearth. Miss Marple moved quietly toward it now. Still no stain upon the carpet, curious indeed. Then her gaze shifted slightly lower. Tiny glass fragments remained beneath the fireplace grate, not beside it, which meant the decanter had not shattered where it currently lay. Someone had moved the pieces afterward. Her eyes softened thoughtfully. Why rearrange a broken decanter unless the original struggle occurred elsewhere? At that moment Inspector Harrow entered behind her. "You've noticed something." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, only that violent arguments tend to be untidy in remarkably inconsistent ways." The inspector glanced toward the hearth, the decanter. "Yes." He frowned deeply. "You think the scene was altered before we arrived?" "I think," Miss Marple replied softly, "someone wished the room to resemble a furious confrontation between father and son." Inspector Harrow folded his arms thoughtfully. "But why stage what already seemed obvious?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the study doorway. "Because obvious explanations are often the safest places to hide uncomfortable truths." Important. Inspector Harrow ordered a more thorough examination of Benedict Ashbourne's study that afternoon. Constables carefully photographed the scattered papers and collected fragments from the broken decanter while servants whispered nervously beyond the corridor doors. Miss Marple remained nearby, seated quietly beside the library window with her knitting resting untouched in her lap. She listened far more than she spoke, which suited the household perfectly. Most people overlooked elderly women who appeared occupied with wool and needles. That, Miss Marple often reflected, was one of society's greatest advantages. Mrs. Bantry entered the library carrying fresh gossip gathered from the kitchens. "My dear," she whispered eagerly, "the servants say Julian quarrelled with nearly everyone in the house during the last fortnight." Miss Marple nodded softly. "Very likely true. He apparently demanded money from Benedict repeatedly, and yesterday morning he argued with Evelyn as well. Interesting indeed. Did anyone overhear the subject?" Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice further. "Charles Ashbourne." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened faintly. The elder son again. Charles Ashbourne's death hovered invisibly over the estate like an old stain nobody successfully removed. At that moment Inspector Harrow entered carrying several recovered letters from Julian's bedroom. "I've found something curious," he announced. Miss Marple looked up politely. The inspector placed the letters upon the table carefully. Julian had been corresponding with a solicitor in London regarding inheritance claims. Benedict Ashbourne, standing nearby, stiffened immediately. "What claims?" Inspector Harrow met his gaze steadily. "Claims involving the estate following Charles Ashbourne's death." Important. Silence settled heavily across the room. Miss Marple noticed Evelyn Ashbourne turn pale almost instantly. Inspector Harrow continued quietly. "According to these documents, Julian believed Charles intended to alter his will shortly before dying." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "To leave the estate elsewhere? Possibly." Benedict's expression darkened. "Nonsense." "Is it?" the inspector asked calmly. "Because Julian appears to have believed someone benefited considerably from Charles dying before those changes occurred." No one spoke for several moments. Then Evelyn rose abruptly from her chair. "This is grotesque." Her composure had finally cracked slightly. Inspector Harrow watched her carefully. "Mrs. Ashbourne, when did you last discuss Charles with Julian?" "Not recently." "Too quick again." Miss Marple lowered her eyes thoughtfully. Rehearsed denial carried its own rhythm. The inspector continued. "Several servants overheard an argument yesterday morning." Evelyn hesitated. "Yes. Julian accused me of hiding documents belonging to Charles." "And were you?" "No." But the answer lacked conviction. After Evelyn left the room, Mrs. Bantry leaned closer anxiously. "She's hiding something, certainly." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "though hidden things are not always murderous things." Later that evening, Miss Marple wandered through the eastern gallery where portraits of previous Ashbourne generations lined the walls beneath dim lamps. The house seemed quieter now, as though morning had settled into the stone itself. Near the far window she encountered Dr. Simon Vale alone. He looked startled to see her. "Oh, Miss Marple." "Good evening, Doctor." He managed a faint smile, though tension lingered heavily around his eyes. "Important." Miss Marple glanced casually toward the rain-darkened gardens outside. "Such tragedies often revive old griefs," she murmured gently. The doctor said nothing, particularly when earlier deaths remain emotionally unresolved. Dr. Vale removed his spectacles slowly. "You're referring to Charles?" "And yes." A long silence followed. Finally the doctor spoke quietly. "Charles Ashbourne was not an easy man. Interesting. Not affectionate. Not grieving." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "He and Julian fought constantly during the final year. About money? About many things." His tone had grown guarded now. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "My dear doctor, families rarely destroy themselves over money alone." Dr. Vale looked away toward the rain outside. "No," he admitted softly. "They usually destroy themselves over loyalty." "Ah, there it is." Before Miss Marple could respond further, footsteps echoed suddenly along the gallery corridor. Evelyn Ashbourne appeared moments later carrying several folded papers tightly against her chest. She stopped abruptly upon seeing them both. For the briefest instant, a genuine alarm crossed her face. Then composure returned. "Inspector Harrow is looking for you, Doctor." Dr. Vale nodded quickly and departed almost at once. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the papers Evelyn held so tightly. Legal documents, perhaps. Or letters. Evelyn noticed the glance immediately and tightened her grip further. "My husband valued privacy," she said quietly. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, my dear. Though privacy has an unfortunate habit of becoming very expensive after death." Evelyn stared at her for one long moment. "Important." Then silently walked away down the darkened corridor, clutching the papers as though they mattered far more than Julian Ashbourne ever had. Important. Rain continued through the night, drumming softly against the tall windows of Ashbourne Court while the household slept uneasily beneath its heavy silence. By morning the estate seemed darker than before, the grey skies pressing low across the cedar trees surrounding the grounds. Miss Marple sat in the morning room shortly after breakfast, knitting quietly while Inspector Harrow paced near the fireplace reviewing his notes once again. "The difficulty," he admitted, "is that everyone at Ashbourne Court appears to possess motive." Mrs. Bantry sighed nervously from the sofa. "That's always a dreadful sign." Inspector Harrow glanced toward Miss Marple. Benedict had financial motives, Evelyn feared exposure regarding Charles' inheritance. Dr. Vale concealed something about the elder son's death. He frowned deeply. And Julian seems to have spent months provoking them all deliberately. Miss Marple nodded softly. Yes, some people enjoy holding secrets over others. It gives them a sense of power. Her needles moved calmly through the wool. Unfortunately, such people rarely appreciate how dangerous frightened families become. At that moment, a constable entered carrying a small leather notebook recovered earlier from Julian Ashbourne's bedroom. "We found this hidden beneath loose floorboards," he announced. Inspector Harrow opened it immediately. Most pages contained scattered financial figures and names, though several entries had been written more hurriedly near the end. One line caught his attention at once. Charles knew before the accident. Father panicked. Evelyn lied to him. A heavy silence settled across the room. Mrs. Bantry inhaled sharply. Inspector Harrow's expression hardened. So Charles' death may not have been accidental after all. Important. Miss Marple's eyes remained lowered thoughtfully. Perhaps, or perhaps someone merely wished it believed. The inspector continued turning pages until another entry appeared. Vale helped cover everything. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harrow snapped the notebook shut. "I want Evelyn and Dr. Vale questioned separately. They found Evelyn Ashbourne in the upstairs sitting room overlooking the gardens. She stood near the window, pale and visibly strained as Inspector Harrow placed Julian's notebook before her. You recognize this?" Yes. "And the accusations inside?" Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Julian became obsessed after Charles died. He imagined conspiracies everywhere. Inspector Harrow watched her steadily. "Did Charles intend to alter his will?" A hesitation. "Yes." Miss Marple noticed it immediately. "Truth this time." The inspector continued calmly. "In whose favor?" Evelyn looked toward the rain-soaked gardens. "Mine." Mrs. Bantry blinked in surprise. "Good heavens!" Evelyn's voice lowered faintly. "Charles no longer trusted his father to manage the estate properly. He planned to leave legal control temporarily to me." Inspector Harrow frowned. "And Benedict knew this?" "Portent." Yes, silence followed. A powerful motive indeed. Yet Miss Marple still felt something essential remained misplaced within the pattern. Inspector Harrow asked quietly, "When did Julian discover the existence of this will?" "Several months ago." "And he threatened exposure?" "Yes." "Did he accuse Benedict directly of causing Charles' death?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "Yes." The room grew very still. Then Miss Marple spoke gently for the first time. "My dear, did you believe Julian?" Evelyn looked startled by the question. "No," she answered immediately. "Important. Too immediate, perhaps." Miss Marple studied her carefully. Not certainty. Fear again. Afterward, Inspector Harrow questioned Dr. Vale in the library. The doctor appeared exhausted now, dark shadows visible beneath his eyes. "You helped conceal something after Charles Ashbourne's death," the inspector stated plainly. Dr. Vale remained silent for several moments. "Yes," Mrs. Bantry gasped softly. Inspector Harrow leaned forward. "What exactly?" The doctor removed his spectacles slowly. "Charles was drinking heavily the night he died, far more heavily than the family admitted publicly." His voice tightened faintly. Benedict feared scandal. So certain details surrounding the accident were softened afterward. Inspector Harrow frowned. "But the accident itself was genuine?" "Yes." Miss Marple observed him quietly. "Truth again, at least mostly." The inspector tapped Julian's notebook thoughtfully. "Then why did Julian believe otherwise?" Dr. Vale's expression darkened. "Because Julian preferred suspicion to grief." "Ah!" A remarkably accurate observation. At that moment, footsteps echoed sharply through the corridor outside. Seconds later, a maid appeared breathlessly at the library door. "Inspector, there's been another incident." Everyone rose instantly. "The old boathouse," the maid stammered nervously. "Someone's tried to burn papers in the fireplace." Inspector Harrow moved immediately toward the door. Miss Marple followed more slowly behind, her thoughts suddenly sharpening. Because frightened people destroyed evidence for only two reasons. Either the evidence proved guilt, or it revealed a truth far worse than murder itself. Important. The old boathouse stood near the far edge of the Ashbourne grounds beside the rain-darkened lake, half concealed beneath drooping willow branches and drifting mist. By the time Inspector Harrow arrived with Miss Marple and the others, the small stone building smelled strongly of smoke. Inside, ashes still glowed faintly within the fireplace. A servant stood nervously near the doorway. "I saw someone leaving only minutes ago," he explained quickly. "Couldn't see clearly through the rain." Inspector Harrow crouched beside the hearth and carefully lifted several half-burned papers with metal tongs. Most had been destroyed completely, but one fragment remained partly readable. Transfer of shares following Charles Ashbourne's death. The inspector's expression darkened immediately. Miss Marple watched silently. Interesting indeed. Someone had not merely wished to destroy documents. They had panicked. Nearby, Evelyn Ashbourne stood visibly pale while Benedict Ashbourne avoided looking directly at the fireplace altogether. Inspector Harrow rose slowly. "Who used this boathouse regularly?" Benedict answered quietly. "Charles did. And after his death?" "No one in particular." Miss Marple glanced toward Evelyn. A tiny hesitation crossed the widow's face. Enough to notice. Inspector Harrow turned sharply. "Mrs. Ashbourne?" Evelyn lowered her eyes. "I came here occasionally." "For what purpose?" Silence. Then softly, "To think." Mrs. Bantry shifted uneasily beside Miss Marple. The inspector continued firmly. "Were those your papers in the fire?" "No." Again too quickly. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly inside her coat sleeves. People lied most poorly when afraid of emotional truths rather than criminal ones. Important. Inspector Harrow ordered the remaining fragments collected before everyone returned toward the hall through cold, drifting rain. As they crossed the terrace, Miss Marple noticed Dr. Vale watching Evelyn carefully, not suspiciously, protectively. Another invisible thread. Later that afternoon, Inspector Harrow gathered the principal members of the household in the drawing room once more. Rain lashed against the windows while lamps cast long shadows across the carpets. The burned documents concerned estate control after Charles Ashbourne's death, the inspector announced calmly. Benedict's jaw tightened. Inspector Harrow continued. "Someone clearly wished for them to be destroyed before we discovered their contents." Evelyn remained very still near the fireplace. Miss Marple observed her closely. Not guilt exactly, dread. The inspector turned toward Benedict. "Did Charles legally transfer financial authority before he died?" "A pause." "Yes." "To whom?" Benedict hesitated painfully. "To Evelyn." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "But why?" Benedict looked exhausted suddenly. "Because Charles believed I mishandled the estate finances." His voice roughened faintly. And perhaps he was correct. Silence followed. Inspector Harrow folded his arms. "So after Charles died unexpectedly, Evelyn inherited temporary control." "Yes." "And Julian discovered this later." Benedict nodded once. Miss Marple's thoughts moved quietly through the growing pattern. Money, inheritance, fear, but still not enough for murder. Inspector Harrow turned toward Evelyn again. "Why hide these documents?" Before she could answer, Dr. Vale suddenly spoke. "Because I advised her to." The room froze. Evelyn stared at him in shock. "Important." The doctor removed his spectacles slowly, exhaustion visible in every movement now. Julian became increasingly unstable after learning about Charles' intentions. He threatened public scandal constantly. Dr. Vale's voice tightened. "I feared what would happen if the village believed Evelyn benefited from Charles' death." Inspector Harrow narrowed his eyes. "So you concealed evidence?" "Yes." "And burned documents?" "Yes." Miss Marple watched him thoughtfully. Another protector. Ashbourne Court seemed full of them. Yet protection often concealed deeper emotions than loyalty alone. Inspector Harrow stepped closer. "Did Julian threaten Evelyn directly the night he died?" Dr. Vale hesitated. "Yes." "What exactly did he say?" The doctor's expression darkened. He claimed Charles' death was no accident. And unless Evelyn surrendered estate control, he intended to reopen everything publicly. A heavy silence settled over the drawing room. Mrs. Bantry whispered softly. How dreadful. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward Evelyn once more. The widow looked shaken now, though something about her fear still felt incomplete. Not fear of exposure. Fear of memory, perhaps. At that moment Miss Marple spoke gently. My dear Mrs. Ashbourne, when Julian confronted you, did he mention something specific about Charles' final night? Evelyn looked up sharply. For the first time since the investigation began, genuine panic crossed her face openly. Inspector Harrow noticed it instantly. What did he mention? Evelyn's voice trembled faintly now. He said Charles argued with someone shortly before the riding accident. Silence. Miss Marple lowered her eyes softly. There it is. Not a financial scandal. Not inheritance. Un argument. Important. And arguments, she reflected quietly, so often became the true beginning of murder long before anyone ever pulled a trigger. Important. The revelation concerning Charles Ashbourne's final argument settled heavily over Ashbourne Court. By evening, the estate no longer felt merely troubled by one recent murder. It felt haunted by two deaths quietly connected through years of secrecy and fear. Rain finally ceased after dusk, though cold mist continued drifting across the cedar-lined grounds outside. Inside the drawing room, conversation remained subdued while Inspector Harrow reviewed timelines again beside the fire. Miss Marple sat quietly nearby with Mrs. Bantry, listening as always. The difficulty, the inspector admitted, is determining whether Charles' death truly relates to Julian's murder or whether Julian merely exploited old suspicions. Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. It all feels connected. Yes, Miss Marple murmured softly. Families often bury unpleasant truths beneath silence until someone begins digging. Inspector Harrow looked thoughtfully toward her. You believe Charles argued with someone important that night? Oh yes. But whether the argument caused his death remains uncertain. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Inspector, uncertainty is often where human beings hide their worst behavior. At that moment a servant entered carrying a small wooden box discovered earlier in one of the unused upstairs bedrooms. We found this among Charles Ashbourne's belongings, he explained nervously. Inspector Harrow opened it carefully. Inside lay several personal letters tied neatly with faded ribbon. Evelyn Ashbourne went visibly pale the instant she saw them. Interesting indeed. The inspector unfolded the first letter slowly. His expression sharpened almost immediately. These are addressed to Dr. Vale. A tense silence filled the room. Mrs. Important. Bantry blinked rapidly between Evelyn and the doctor. Inspector Harrow continued reading quietly before lifting his eyes. They appear personal. Dr. Vale's face tightened faintly. Evelyn lowered her gaze. Miss Marple folded her hands softly. Ah. At last another hidden thread surfaced. Inspector Harrow spoke carefully. You and Evelyn Ashbourne were involved emotionally before Charles died. Neither answered immediately. Finally Dr. Vale said quietly, Yes. The silence afterward felt enormous. Benedict Ashbourne stared at them both in visible shock. Inspector Harrow's voice hardened slightly. And Charles discovered this? Evelyn answered faintly. Yes. Mrs. Bantry inhaled sharply. Miss Marple watched Evelyn carefully now. Not guilt, grief. Old grief long buried beneath years of restraint. Inspector Harrow leaned forward. Did Charles confront you? Yes. And Dortwale? Yes. The doctor spoke quietly. Charles was furious at first, but eventually he intended ending the marriage peacefully. Inspector Harrow frowned. Yet he died before doing so. Another silence followed. Dangerous indeed. Inspector Harrow's eyes narrowed. Julian knew about the affair. Evelyn nodded slowly. He discovered the letters after Charles died, and used them against you. Yes. Miss Marple glanced softly toward the fireplace. Blackmail again. But now emotional rather than financial. How very human. Inspector Harrow continued calmly. Julian threatened exposure unless you surrendered control of the estate. Yes. And Dr. Vale feared scandal if the affair became public. The doctor's expression darkened. I feared what people would assume about Charles' death. Reasonably so. Miss Marple noticed Benedict Ashbourne watching them both now with growing horror. "Important. My son knew?" he whispered. Evelyn looked toward him sadly. "Yes." The old man sank slowly into a nearby chair. Everything inside Ashbourne Court seemed to unravel at once now. Reputation, marriage, inheritance, trust. Inspector Harrow rose thoughtfully. "This changes matters considerably." "Oh yes," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Affection complicates crimes far more thoroughly than money." The inspector glanced toward her. "You believe the affair is central?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied softly, "that Julian possessed an unfortunate talent for discovering exactly what frightened people most." A heavy silence followed. Then suddenly Miss Marple recalled something else entirely. The study, the overturned armchair, the moved decanter, the strangely controlled disorder. Her eyes softened thoughtfully. Not rage, not panic alone. Someone had staged the room carefully because they feared what investigators might otherwise notice. Something emotional, something intimate. At that moment Inspector Harrow spoke again. "There's still one matter unresolved." He looked toward Evelyn steadily. "Where exactly were you before the gunshot?" Evelyn hesitated too long. Miss Marple noticed immediately. Finally Evelyn answered quietly. "I walked briefly through the western corridor." Mrs. Bantry stared. "The study corridor?" "Yes." Inspector Harrow stepped forward. "Did you enter the study before Julian died?" Evelyn's face had gone completely pale now. For several long seconds she could not answer. Then softly, "Yes." The room fell silent. Miss Marple lowered her knitting gently into her lap. Because at last, the murder itself had finally begun revealing its true shape. Important. The confession that Evelyn Ashbourne had entered Benedict's study before Julian's death altered the atmosphere of Ashbourne Court completely. Whatever fragile certainty had remained inside the household now dissolved into fresh suspicion and fear. Inspector Harrow questioned her immediately in the library while rainwater dripped softly from the cedar branches outside the tall windows. Miss Marple sat quietly near the fire with Mrs. Bantry observing. Evelyn appeared exhausted now, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to fracture beneath the strain of concealed truths. "You entered the study before the shooting," Inspector Harrow said calmly. "Why?" Evelyn clasped her hands tightly together. "To speak with Julian. About the letters." "Yes." "And the estate?" The inspector nodded slightly. "What happened?" Evelyn looked toward the dark windows rather than at anyone present. Julian was drinking heavily. He threatened to expose everything. Her voice trembled faintly now. "The affair. Charlotte's intentions regarding the estate. All of it." Inspector Harrow studied her carefully. "Did he threaten to accuse you of involvement in Charlotte's death?" "Yes." "And how did you respond?" "I begged him to stop." A silence followed. Miss Marple watched Evelyn thoughtfully. Truth again, but not all of it. Inspector Harrow continued. "Did the argument become violent?" "No." "Did Julian threaten you physically?" Evelyn hesitated briefly. "He grabbed my arm." "Interesting. Not fear of injury. Fear of humiliation, perhaps." The inspector leaned forward slightly. "And then?" "I left, alive, yes." Inspector Harrow folded his arms. "But nobody saw you leave the corridor." Evelyn said nothing. Mrs. Bantry shifted nervously beside Miss Marple. "Important." The inspector's voice hardened faintly. "Mrs. Ashbourne, you understand how this appears." "Yes?" Miss Marple lowered her eyes softly. Too obvious again. The pattern repeated itself. Every new revelation pointed neatly toward another suspect, yet never entirely convincingly. Someone had manipulated appearances from the beginning. Inspector Harrow eventually dismissed Evelyn, though suspicion now lingered heavily around her. After she left, Dr. Vale entered almost immediately, visibly tense. "You believe she killed him," he said quietly. The inspector replied calmly. "I believe she had a motive." Dr. Vale removed his spectacles sharply. "She is not capable of murder." Miss Marple glanced toward him gently. "My dear doctor, people are capable of remarkable things when frightened." He looked away instantly. "Ah, fear again. Always fear." Inspector Harrow studied him carefully. You loved Evelyn Ashbourne. Yes. And Julian threatened to destroy her reputation publicly. Yes. So you also possessed a motive. The doctor's jaw tightened faintly. I did not kill Julian. Silence followed. Then Miss Marple spoke softly for the first time. Dore vale. When you entered the study after the gunshot, what was the very first thing you noticed? The question startled him slightly. The body. Before that? He frowned faintly, thinking. The smell of whiskey. Miss Marple nodded gently. And yet remarkably little whiskey actually spilled. Inspector Harrow's eyes sharpened immediately. The decanter. Yes. Miss Marple folded her hands softly. Someone broke it elsewhere and moved it afterward. The inspector stared thoughtfully toward the library carpet, meaning the struggle did not occur near the fireplace. Exactly. Dr. Vale looked suddenly uneasy. Important. Miss Marple noticed at once. My dear doctor, she asked gently, did you touch anything inside the study? No. Too quickly. Inspector Harrow caught it too. You're certain? A pausa. Then, reluctantly, I straightened the armchair. Mrs. Bantry blinked. What? The doctor exhaled tiredly. It had fallen awkwardly across Julian's leg. I moved it instinctively while checking for signs of life. Inspector Harrow stepped closer. So the scene was altered before anyone else entered. Yes, but only slightly. Miss Marple's eyes softened thoughtfully. Not slightly enough. The inspector continued quietly. Did you notice anyone else inside the corridor before the shooting? Dr. Vale hesitated. Yes. Silence filled the room instantly. Who? Benedict Ashbourne. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harrow frowned deeply. He claimed he left earlier. I saw him near the doorway moments before the gunshot. Another contradiction. Another shifting timeline, Mrs. Bantry whispered anxiously. Good heavens. Miss Marple remained very still, because suddenly one detail returned sharply to her memory. When the shot rang out during dinner, Evelyn had looked resigned, not frightened, not shocked, resigned. As though something dreadful had already become inevitable long before anyone died, and people only looked that way, Miss Marple reflected quietly when they expected violence before it happened. Important. By the following morning, Ashbourne Court had become a house divided entirely by suspicion. Servants whispered nervously in corners, meals passed in near silence, and every glance between family members seemed burdened by years of concealed resentment. Inspector Harrow spent most of the day reconstructing the final hour before Julian Ashbourne's death. Yet the more statements he reviewed, the less certain the sequence became. Benedict claimed he left the study before Julian arrived. Evelyn admitted entering afterward. Dr. Vale confessed altering the room slightly before others entered. And still the murder itself remained strangely unclear. Miss Marple sat quietly in the conservatory overlooking the rain-soaked gardens while Mrs. Bantry paced nearby anxiously. My dear, Mrs. Bantry whispered. Surely one of them must finally break. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, they already have. Several times. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Then why is everything still so confusing? Because, Miss Marple replied softly, they are all protecting different things. A silence followed. Then suddenly footsteps approached across the tiled floor. Inspector Harrow entered carrying another document folder recovered from Julian's private desk. I've found something significant, he announced. Miss Marple looked up politely. The inspector opened the folder carefully. Inside rested a signed statement prepared by Julian himself but never delivered officially. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward nervously. What does it say? Inspector Harrow's expression darkened. Julian intended accusing Benedict Ashbourne publicly of financial fraud and concealment following Charles' death. He paused briefly. Important. But he also states he possesses proof that Charles argued violently with his father shortly before the riding accident. Silence settled heavily through the conservatory. Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. Not surprising. Families rarely collapsed from one secret alone. Inspector Harrow continued quietly. There's more. He removed another paper. A witness statement drafted but unsigned. From whom? Mrs. Bantry asked. Stable hand Thomas read. Miss Marple's attention sharpened slightly. Interesting indeed. Inspector Harrow read aloud slowly. I heard shouting near the stables the night before Mr. Charles died. Mr. Benedict and Mr. Charles arguing. Mr. Charles said he intended leaving Ashbourne Court and exposing everything. A heavy silence followed. Mrs. Bantry looked horrified. My goodness! Inspector Harrow lowered the paper. The stable hand left service 2 days after Charles' death. Miss Marple nodded softly. Convenient timing. The inspector frowned deeply. Julian clearly believed Charles' death involved more than an accident. Yes, Miss Marple murmured gently, though belief and truth are not always identical. At that moment Benedict Ashbourne himself entered the conservatory unexpectedly. He looked older now than when the investigation began, the strain finally visible beneath his carefully controlled manner. Inspector Harrow rose immediately. I was just reviewing your son's accusations. Benedict's expression hardened faintly. I assumed as much. The inspector held up the witness statement. Did you argue with Charles before his death? Yes. Mrs. Bantry gasped softly. Benedict continued tiredly. He intended to leave the estate entirely. He blamed me for its financial collapse. His eyes lowered briefly. Important. We said unforgivable things to one another. Inspector Harrow stepped closer. And the following day Charles died. Yes, silence filled the room. Then Miss Marple spoke quietly. My dear Mr. Ashbourne, did Julian ever threaten to expose your argument publicly? Benedict looked toward her. Yes. And how did that make you feel? The old man gave a faint, exhausted laugh. Terrified. Finally, honesty. Miss Marple watched him carefully now. Not murderous terror, something sadder. Fear of disgrace. Fear of losing what remained of his family's reputation. Inspector Harrow continued calmly. You were seen near the study corridor shortly before the shooting. Yes, but you claimed earlier to have already left. Benedict hesitated visibly. I returned. Why? Another pause. To stop Julian from humiliating Evelyn publicly. Interesting indeed. Not himself, Evelyn. Miss Marple's thoughts moved swiftly now through the tangled pattern. Everyone inside Ashbourne Court had been protecting someone else. Evelyn protected Charles' memory. Dr. Vale protected Evelyn. Benedict protected the family name. And Julian had weaponized every secret he discovered. At that moment, Miss Marple suddenly recalled something seemingly insignificant from the night of the murder. Julian's toast at dinner. To be honest, a rare and endangered quality at Ashbourne Court. Not triumphant, provocative, deliberately provocative, as though he wanted someone pushed beyond restraint. Her eyes softened thoughtfully. Ah! Now at last the final shape of the tragedy began revealing itself clearly. Not a carefully planned murder, a confrontation, a moment of emotional collapse hidden afterward beneath layers of fear, loyalty and shame. Important. And only one person inside Ashbourne Court had feared exposure enough to destroy the truth immediately after the shot was fired. Important. That evening the remaining members of the household gathered once more in the drawing room of Ashbourne Court. Rain had finally stopped, though mist still drifted faintly beyond the tall windows overlooking the dark gardens. The atmosphere inside felt heavy with exhaustion. Inspector Harrow stood near the fireplace while Benedict Ashbourne sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, his face lined with strain. Evelyn remained silent beside the window, and Dr. Vale lingered nearby like a man awaiting inevitable disaster. Miss Marple sat quietly beside Mrs. Bantry, her knitting resting untouched once again. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Inspector Harrow addressed the room calmly. Miss Marple believes she understands what truly happened the night Julian Ashbourne died. All eyes turned toward her. Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear friends, this has never been a simple murder motivated by money alone. Her soft voice carried easily through the silent room. It concerned fear, particularly the fear of exposure. Benedict lowered his gaze. Miss Marple continued quietly. Julian Ashbourne possessed a most unfortunate talent for discovering painful secrets. Once discovered, he used them mercilessly. No one disagreed. He threatened Benedict with a financial scandal. He threatened Evelyn regarding her relationship with Dr. Vale. And he repeatedly reopened suspicions surrounding Charles Ashbourne's death. Miss Marple folded her hands softly. Eventually, the entire household became frightened of him. Inspector Harrow nodded slightly, but fear alone does not explain the shooting. No, Miss Marple agreed, because the shooting itself was not planned. A tense silence followed. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward Evelyn Ashbourne now. Important. You entered the study first that evening, hoping to persuade Julian to stop. Evelyn nodded faintly. Yes, he refused. Yes, and afterward Benedict entered. The old man closed his eyes briefly. Miss Marple continued softly. Julian deliberately provoked him. About Charles, about the estate, about Evelyn. Her expression saddened faintly. And Julian understood precisely where to wound people emotionally. Inspector Harrow stepped forward slightly. So Benedict shot him. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No. The room fell silent instantly. Benedict looked up in surprise. Miss Marple turned instead toward Dr. Simon Vale. It was you, Doctor. The colour drained slowly from his face. Mrs. Bantry gasped softly. Inspector Harrow stared sharply. Dr. Vale said nothing. Miss Marple's voice remained calm and kind. You entered the study during the argument. Julian threatened once again to expose Evelyn publicly, knowing perfectly well how much damage it would cause. She paused gently. And then he mocked Charles' death. A flicker of pain crossed the doctor's face. There was a struggle near the desk. Miss Marple continued softly. Not near the fireplace. That is why the decanter was moved afterward. Her eyes rested quietly upon him. Julian reached for Benedict's revolver. You attempted stopping him. The gun discharged. Silence filled the room. Then finally Dr. Vale spoke faintly. Yes. Evelyn stared at him in horror. The doctor removed his spectacles slowly, his hands trembling now with exhaustion. It happened so quickly, he whispered. Julian was drunk and furious. He grabbed the revolver and began shouting that he would destroy all of us. His voice broke slightly. I tried taking it from him. Inspector Harrow spoke carefully. Important. And afterward? Dr. Vale lowered his head. I panicked. Miss Marple nodded sadly. Yes. You staged the room to resemble a confrontation between father and son. Her gaze softened. Because you believed suspicion would naturally fall upon Benedict. The doctor closed his eyes. I only wanted to protect Evelyn. There it was again. Protection. The most dangerous motive of all. Inspector Harrow stepped closer quietly. You moved the decanter, scattered the papers, altered the study before anyone arrived. Yes. And later helped conceal evidence connected to Charles' death as well. Dr. Vale nodded weakly. I thought if the family survived one scandal, perhaps they could survive another. Miss Marple sighed softly. My dear doctor, concealed truths rarely disappear. They merely wait. A long silence followed. Outside, mist drifted slowly away from the cedar trees as moonlight finally touched the darkened grounds of Ashbourne Court once more. Inspector Harrow placed a gentle hand upon the doctor's shoulder. I am afraid you must come with me. Dr. Vale gave no resistance. As he walked toward the doorway, Evelyn suddenly covered her face quietly with trembling hands. Benedict Ashbourne stared silently into the fire like a man witnessing the final collapse of everything he once fought desperately to preserve. Mrs. Bantry exhaled softly after the door closed. What terrible sadness! Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes. Her eyes drifted toward the quiet windows overlooking the estate. Families often believe loyalty will save them. She folded her knitting carefully into her lap. But when loyalty depends upon silence, tragedy usually follows close behind.